Daniel Carter's boots echoed on the cracked pavement of his childhood street, each step a reminder of the wars he'd fought, one in deserts far away, the other in the home he'd abandoned. He'd come to say goodbye to his wife, her death a wound no metal could heal. The funeral was quiet, too quiet, until the air turned electric and the coffin jolted. It was splintering as something inside clawed for freedom, something that knew his name. The bus hissed to a stop on the edge of town, its brakes sighing like a tired animal. Daniel Carter stepped down into the thin November air, his boots meeting the cracked pavement with a sound that seemed too loud for a place this still. A duffel hung from one shoulder, heavy more from memory than weight. Across the street, a hardware store sat dark behind dusty windows. Farther down, the diner's sign flickered once, then went out completely. The sky was the kind that pressed down on you. Low clouds, gray as old wool, the sun nowhere to be found. He stood there for a moment, letting the cold find its way through the seams of his jacket. The town smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp leaves, a scent he remembered from years ago, before the war, before everything unraveled. He began walking. His steps echoed against buildings that hadn't changed but somehow felt foreign. A mailbox leaned at an angle as if it had been trying to leave for years. The sidewalks were littered with brittle sycamore leaves, gathering in corners like secrets no one wanted to speak. Every turn brought him closer to a place he wasn't sure he wanted to see. When he reached the end of Main Street, the view opened onto the churchyard. Cars lined the gravel lot, doors swinging open as people stepped out, coats drawn tight. The air was thicker here, weighted with the muffled hum of voices and the occasional sharp ring of the church bell. It was the bell that told him before he saw it. He stopped at the iron gate. Through it, rows of headstones rose from the grass like silent witnesses. A canopy had been set up near the far edge, the kind funeral homes used to shield mourners from weather. Beneath it, a dark wooden casket rested on a frame above a rectangle of raw earth. Folding chairs faced it, most of them occupied. Daniel's eyes went to the photograph on the easel beside the casket. The smile was the same one he remembered, soft at the corners, eyes that seemed to see right through him. Mary Ann, his wife. The sound around him blurred, the shuffle of feet and murmurs folding into a low, steady rush in his ears. He couldn't recall breathing. He couldn't recall moving, but somehow his hand had found the gate, gripping the cold iron so hard it bit into his skin. He didn't remember the walk from the gate to the outer edge of the crowd, but there he was, standing behind the last row of chairs, close enough to see the fine grain in the wood of the casket. The pastor's voice drifted over, steady practiced. Words like rest, peace, and forever floated in the air like fragile glass. The casket was already half lowered. He thought about the months, years he'd been gone, the letters that had stopped coming, the absence he hadn't been able to bridge. And now this. Final. Except a movement. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, the way the wind stirred the canopy's fabric. But no, the casket shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if something within had pressed back. He felt it in his chest before he believed it with his eyes. The crowd gasped. Someone cried out, a chair clattering against the frozen ground. Daniel didn't move. His boots felt rooted, his hands cold and empty. A soldier learns to read the impossible without flinching, but this pulled the air from him. Then came a voice, not loud, not even fully formed, but enough to cut through the winter air. A child's sob, close to the ground. He turned his head slowly. A little girl knelt beside the casket, small hands pressed to the polished wood. She was no one he recognized, yet her grief was a mirror of something in him. Raw, unguarded, too large for her to carry. Someone moved toward her, but Daniel found himself stepping forward first, as though pulled by a thread he hadn't known was there. The ground beneath his boots was soft from recent rain, the scent of damp earth rising with each step. When he reached her, the girl didn't look up. She whispered something into the seam where lid met base, the words slipping through like secrets meant for the dark. Daniel caught only one, Mama. He stood there, not speaking, not sure what could be said. The cold worked its way through his sleeves, up to his shoulders, and still he stayed. The bell rang again, a single note that seemed to hang in the air far too long. For the first time since stepping off the bus, Daniel realized he didn't know what day it was, or if it mattered anymore. The funeral ended not with a sharp conclusion, but with a slow unraveling. People rose in twos and threes, their voices low, their steps careful on the uneven ground. The wind had picked up, drawing scarves tighter, blowing dried leaves against the casket's base. Daniel stayed at the edge, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, watching the girl cling to the box as if she could keep it from being taken away. No one spoke to him. A few eyes flicked his way, not curious exactly, but measuring as if trying to decide whether to acknowledge him. He recognized some of those faces from years ago, when he and Marianne had walked these same streets together. The recognition in their eyes faded quickly into something more guarded. The girl was eventually led away by an older woman with a heavy gray shawl, her small hand swallowed in the other's grip. She didn't look back. The casket was lowered fully into the ground. Dirt began to fall, each thud a small, unceremonious finality. Daniel turned before it was done. He followed the gravel path out to the road, the cold biting harder now that the canopy was behind him. The bus was long gone. His boots carried him along without any particular plan, just the muscle memory of old routes. He passed the corner store where he and Marianne had once bought coffee on Sunday mornings. The windows were papered over, the for lease sign sun-faded. The further he walked, the more the streets seemed to pull away from him. Mailboxes leaned like tired sentinels. Yard fences bowed in defeat. Even the light had a way of avoiding the ground, caught instead in the bare branches overhead. When he reached the house, he stopped at the edge of the path. The paint had peeled in wide strips, revealing the dull gray of the boards beneath. The front steps sagged toward the center, the railing missing in one section. The windows stared blankly back at him, curtains drawn in a way that suggested no one had opened them in months. His key still fit, though the lock resisted at first, as if holding on to the memory of someone else's hand. Inside, the air was cold and stale, thick with the scent of dust and something faintly metallic. He dropped the duffel by the door and stood in the narrow entryway. The silence had weight here, pressing against him. In the living room, a thin film of dust lay across every surface. The old sofa was still angled toward the window, the one piece of furniture Marianne had insisted they keep from her mother's house. A coffee mug sat on the side table, its contents long evaporated, leaving only a dark ring at the bottom. Daniel walked through slowly, his hand trailing the wall. In the kitchen, a single plate rested in the drying rack, as though someone had intended to come back for it. A calendar hung crooked on the wall, the page still showing the month he'd shipped out. The square for the day he left had been marked with a small red X. No other days were marked. He moved to the back door, opened it, and stepped onto the porch. The yard was overgrown, the grass brittle under the frost. The garden beds Marianne had kept were just outlines now, their wooden frames leaning like tired shoulders. He remembered her hands in the soil, the way she'd push her hair back with the back of her wrist, leaving a smear of dirt across her cheek. He could hear her laugh in the wind, faint and almost cruel in its accuracy. Leaning against the porch rail, Daniel tried to piece together the months between the last letter and today. He thought of calling someone, but there was no one left who wouldn't have heard already. The feeling that settled over him was not grief in its rawest form. He'd known that before, in different shapes, but something slower, heavier. A kind of helplessness that made even the next step unclear. The sky had darkened by the time he went back inside. He found himself in the small bedroom they'd once shared. The bed was stripped, the mattress bare, dust motes drifting in the weak light. On the floor near the closet was a box. He crouched, pulled it closer. Inside were envelopes, most unopened, the paper yellowing at the edges. Beneath them, a folded wool scarf he recognized instantly, hers. The faint scent of lavender still clung to it, though weaker now. He sat on the floor with the box in his lap until the shadows filled the room. There was no urgency to move, no clear reason to stay. Just the slow rhythm of his own breath in the quiet, and the sense that he had returned to something that could never be restored to what it was. When the cold began to sting his hands, he set the box back where he found it. In the hallway, his duffel waited by the door. He didn't unpack. He didn't turn on the lights. That night, Daniel lay on the floor in the empty living room, his jacket still on, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the wind moved through the sycamores, and somewhere far off, a dog barked once, then fell silent. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Morning came without warning. No shift in light, no bird call, just the gray of the ceiling turning from dark to a softer shade. Daniel was still on the floor. His body ached in the way it does when sleep comes only in fragments, each one too shallow to count. The house was colder than the night before. His breath drifted in faint clouds as he pushed himself up. He boiled water for coffee in an old enamel kettle. Its handle loose, the spout chipped. The tin of grounds was almost empty, and he measured it by instinct, not caring if the taste came out too weak. He drank standing at the kitchen counter, staring at the frost on the window glass. Out in the yard, the skeletal remains of the garden were sharp in the morning light. Every now and then the wind rattled a loose board on the fence, the sound oddly human, like a sigh he couldn't place. He tried to think of the day ahead, but there was nothing to arrange. No appointments, no calls. Just the open stretch of hours, wide and heavy. It had been like this in the first weeks after deployment, but back then there had been training schedules, barracks noise. The predictable hum of someone else deciding the shape of your day. Here it was silence and choice, and neither one felt like a gift. By midday, he found himself in the small room at the front of the house, the one that used to be a kind of study. The desk was still there, though one leg had splintered where the wood had warped. Dust lay thick across the surface. On it sat a photograph in a cheap frame. Him and Marianne in front of the county fair gates, the year before he'd enlisted. She was holding a paper cone of cotton candy, her hair pulled into a knot, her eyes squinting against the sun. His arm was around her shoulder. The colors in the print had faded into a kind of sepia memory, as if the photograph itself had decided to grow old. He set the picture back down and opened the desk drawer. Inside were a few pens, dried out, and a folded map of the county. On the back, in Marianne's handwriting, were lists, groceries, errands, small reminders like call Mom about the peach tree. Her handwriting stopped halfway down the page, cut off midward. Daniel put the map in his jacket pocket without thinking. The next few days passed without distinct edges. He fell into a pattern, waking late, making coffee, walking the length of the property, as if to confirm it was still there. Sometimes he'd stand at the front steps and watch the street, counting the cars that passed. They were never more than a handful, most of them unfamiliar. On the fourth day, he walked into town. The distance felt longer than it used to, the road unrolling in a slow gray ribbon. At the post office, he checked the box, empty. He lingered outside the hardware store, its windows stacked with tools and seed packets, then moved on without going inside. Passing the diner, he caught a glimpse of himself in the window, unshaven, shoulders slightly hunched. A figure that could easily be mistaken for someone passing through rather than someone who belonged. He bought bread at the corner market, nodding when the cashier asked if he needed a bag. Her tone was polite but detached, the kind reserved for strangers or people you only half remember. Back at the house, he ate standing at the kitchen counter again, the bread still warm enough to steam in the cold air. That night, he sat on the porch steps with a blanket over his shoulders. The sky was clear for the first time since the funeral, the stars sharp against the black. He could hear the creek beyond the back fence, its winter flow low and deliberate. It was there in that quiet that the helplessness pressed in hardest. Not the kind born of fear, but the slow, suffocating kind, the realization that nothing could undo the days he'd been gone, the choices made in that absence, the way the town had gone on without him. He thought of the girl at the cemetery again, the way her hands had gripped the casket. He didn't know her name, didn't know if she had a place to sleep that night, but she had been the only person in that moment who seemed entirely certain of what she felt, and that certainty had lodged in him like a stone. By the end of the week, the box in the bedroom had moved to the kitchen table. He'd started opening the envelopes, 1 or 2 each night. Most were bills, notices from the bank, a few cards with short, awkward condolences. None explained the gap between the woman he'd left and the one lowered into the ground. Still, he kept reading them, not for answers, but because the act of opening them gave the hours a kind of anchor. On the 8th morning, he found himself at the garden again, crouched in the brittle grass. Without deciding to, he began pulling up the dead stalks, stacking them into neat piles. His fingers stiffened in the cold, but he didn't stop until the beds were clear. It wasn't repair. It wasn't even planting. But it was something that could be done, and for now, that was enough to hold back the emptiness for a little while longer. The wind came from the north that morning, sharp enough to cut through the seams of his jacket. Daniel woke before the sun, the frost still unbroken on the grass. For a long moment, he sat at the edge of the bed, elbows on knees, staring at the floorboards as if they might tell him what to do next. He put on his boots, the laces stiff with dried mud, and stepped outside. The air stung his lungs. Out in the yard, The piles of dead stalks he'd cleared the day before were rimmed with white, each one catching the pale light that leaked over the hills. Daniel fetched the old wheelbarrow from behind the shed. One of its handles was split, the rubber grip peeling away, but it would hold for now. He loaded the piles into it slowly, careful not to scatter the brittle stems. The wheel squeaked each time it turned, a sound that seemed too loud for the hour. By the time he'd hauled the last load to the edge of the property, the sun was a low band of gold along the ridge. He burned the stalks in a shallow pit, the smoke rising straight up before the wind pulled it sideways. The smell was dry and faintly sweet, the kind that lingers in your clothes. He stood watching until the last ember dulled. Inside, the kitchen was warmer than usual from the light streaming through the east-facing window. He made coffee again, though the tin was nearly empty. As it brewed, he found himself scanning the shelves, jars of beans long past their dates, a sack of flour hardened into a lump. The house had the feel of a place paused in mid-use, as if someone had stepped out with the intention of returning, only to never make it back. He pulled everything down, one item at a time, setting aside what could be salvaged. He wiped the shelves with a damp rag, watching the water turn brown in the bucket. The small, repetitive motion gave him something to hold on to, even as his mind slipped into its own spaces. When the shelves were clean, he turned to the hallway. A cobweb hung like lace in the upper corner, its threads catching the light. He reached up with a broom and swept it away, careful not to disturb the picture frame beneath it, a photograph of the house from decades ago, the paint bright, the yard full of wildflowers. It was late afternoon by the time he reached the front porch. The boards there sagged under his weight, one plank cracked nearly through. He ran a hand over the splintered edge, feeling the grain. Somewhere in the shed, there might be wood to fix it. Or maybe not. Instead, he swept the porch, pushing aside leaves, dust, and the brittle husks of insect that had curled in the corners. Daniel hesitated, then lifted his own hand in return. The gesture was small, but it left a trace of something in the air, as if the silence between them had been slightly altered. That night, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a candle burning in the center. The flame made the shadows lean across the walls. He had found a small notepad in one of the drawers earlier, its cover bent and corners softened from use. Without thinking too much, he began making a list. Fix porch board. Check shed for lumber. Clear back fence line. He didn't write why or for whom. Just the tasks, plain and unadorned. The act of putting them on paper made them real in a way they hadn't been in his mind. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm. Morning frost, coffee. One task from the list. The back fence was choked with ivy, so he cut it back until the boards appeared, gray and weathered but still standing. In the shed, he found enough wood to mend the porch. While he worked, the town went on around him, mostly unseen. A few children passed on their way to school, their laughter carried by the wind. In the distance, a dog barked, then stopped. One afternoon, as he was replacing the porch board, he noticed a small figure watching from across the street. A girl, maybe 10, her hair tucked under a knit cap. She stood still for a moment, then turned and walked away. He didn't call out. It was only later, sitting on the newly mended step, that he realized he had been waiting for her to come back. The work didn't erase the emptiness, but it gave shape to the hours. By the end of each day, his hands were marked with dust and splinters, his muscles aching in a way that felt earned. The house, in its quiet way, was beginning to look less abandoned. And though Daniel couldn't have said it out loud, there was a flicker, faint, almost hidden, that maybe he wasn't just keeping the house from falling apart. Maybe, in some way, he was keeping himself from doing the same. The frost was lighter that morning, but the air carried a dampness that sank into the bones. Daniel stepped outside with his coffee, steam rising from the mug. The yard was still, except for the faint drip of water from the eaves where ice was melting. He walked to the back fence, the one he'd cleared of ivy last week. The boards looked different now, not just because they were visible, but because they belonged again to the landscape. The wood was rough under his palm, still solid despite the years. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Across the narrow alley behind the house, the same girl from before stood watching. She was in the same knit cap, this time with a scarf wrapped twice around her neck. Her hands were in her coat pockets, her posture straight but not stiff. For a moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them felt longer than it was. Daniel took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle in his chest. He gave a small nod, barely more than a tilt of the chin. The girl didn't return it. She turned, walking along the alley until she was out of sight. He stayed at the fence a little longer than needed, listening to the quiet. A crow called from somewhere up the hill, the sound flat and unhurried. Later that day, he was in the shed looking for nails when he found an old tin lunchbox. Its paint was chipped, the latch rusted, but it still opened with a creak. Inside were screws, some loose change, and a folded photograph. The picture was of a summer picnic, people sitting on a blanket, paper plates in their laps, the grass high around them. He didn't recognize anyone, but the easy way they leaned toward one another made his throat tighten. He set it back inside the box and returned it to the shelf. That afternoon, he worked on the front steps again. The new board had settled well, but two more were soft underfoot. As he pried up the first, he felt the presence before he saw her. The girl was at the edge of the yard this time, just beyond the low picket fence. She wasn't looking at him exactly, more the house, her gaze tracing the windows, the roof line, the yard. "You live here now?" she asked. Once in the late afternoon, sitting on the curb as he came back from the hardware store. Each time, they exchanged only a few words. But something about her steadiness pulled against the quiet that had settled too deeply in the house. On the 8th day, Daniel found himself walking toward the corner store for coffee grounds. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from chimneys. When he reached the end of the block, he heard footsteps behind him. It was her. She kept pace a few steps back, not speaking, not hurrying. When they reached the store, she stopped at the doorway. "You gonna be fixing more of it?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. She nodded again, then pointed toward the shelf of penny candy inside. "They got the kind with the licorice swirls. My granddad used to buy 'em for me." Daniel didn't answer, but when he came out with his coffee, there was a small paper bag folded in his hand. He sat on the low fence in front of her without a word. By the time he reached his gate, she had already turned the corner, the bag gone. That evening, working in the fading light. But he could feel the edge of it, the part where something had been lost. It wasn't much, this strange rhythm between them, a nod, a question, a bag of candy, but it was enough to shift the air in the house. When he blew out the candle that night, the dark didn't feel quite as hollow. The wind picked up overnight. By morning, he stood with it in his hand for a long moment, the rake leaning against his leg. The paper was slightly damp, the corner softened from the fog. He thought about leaving it unopened on the kitchen table, letting it sit there the way unopened letters had once piled on the counter when he was away on deployment. Instead, he went inside, sat on the table, and poured himself coffee. Only after a few sips did he slide a finger under the flap. Inside was a single sheet of line paper. The handwriting was uneven, the letters small and pressed close together. "You don't know me, but my grandma says you're fixing up the Carter place. I'm glad. Nobody's cared about it in a long time. My granddad used to sit on that porch with me and tell me stories about fishing in the river. The boards creaked the same way back then. Just thought you should know someone remembers. No name. Letters that told you more in what they didn't say than in what they did." He looked out the kitchen window at the porch. He could almost see an older man in a flannel shirt, leaning back in a chair, speaking low while a child listened. The image stayed with him long after he turned back to his coffee. By midday, he decided to work on the porch rail. The old paint flaked off in strips under the scraper, revealing the pale wood beneath. It was slow work, the kind that left room for the mind to wander. He thought about the girl, her steady gaze, the scarf, the licorice candy. He thought about the letter, and how someone her age might have chosen to stay anonymous. Around 4, the light began to thin. Daniel put away his tools and went to lock the gate. A shadow moved near the corner of the yard. The girl was there again, this time holding something small in both hands. She didn't speak, just sat on top of the fence post. It was a single dried flower. The petals curled inward like they were guarding something. She gave a brief nod and walked away. Daniel left it there until after dark, when the air grew too cold. Inside, he placed it next to the letter on the kitchen table. That night, he sat in the chair by the window, watching the street lamp throw its pale circle onto the sidewalk. He realized he hadn't thought about leaving in several days. Before, every morning had started with the idea that he might pack a bag, that this stop in the old house was temporary. Now, the thought felt less urgent, replaced by something quieter, not quite belonging, but not entirely passing through. The next morning, he woke earlier than usual. The frost had returned, thin and glassy on the steps. He filled the kettle, lit the stove, and looked again at the table. The letter, the dried flower. Together, they seemed like pieces of a message still being written. For the first time since arriving, Daniel found himself wondering what the house might look like a year from now. Not the quick repairs to make it livable, but the deeper work, the way a place changes when someone means to keep it, to live in it. It wasn't a plan, not yet, but it was more than he'd had when he first walked through the door. And as the kettle began to whistle, he understood that some things you fix with your hands, and some with your staying. The day began with a kind of brightness that didn't belong to winter. A thin sun broke through the cloud cover, and the light spilled over the frost in the yard, making every patch of grass shimmer, as if it had been dusted with ground glass. Daniel stood on the porch with a mug in his hand, letting the steam rise into his face. It had been weeks since he arrived, but this was the first morning he noticed how the air smelled when the wind shifted from the river. Not just cold, but carrying a faint mineral tang, like old stones after rain. It reminded him of somewhere he couldn't quite place. Inside, the letter and the dried flowers still sat on the table. He'd moved them once to sweep, and then put them back in exactly the same spot. Almost without thinking, they felt like the kind of things you kept in sight, as if their presence might keep you from drifting back into the same quiet emptiness that had been waiting when he first came home. He decided that morning to fix the front steps. They had sagged for years, the wood darkened by weather and neglect. He'd stepped over the worst one every day, the way you learn to avoid a weak spot in a trail. But the habit had started to feel like an avoidance of more than just rotting timber. He found a box of nails in the garage, square-headed, the kind no one seemed to make anymore, and a hammer with a handle worn smooth from years of use. Whoever had lived here before him had worked with their hands, the marks of it left in the tools. The workbench scarred from 1,000 small projects. Daniel removed the damaged plank and set it aside. The sound of the hammer rang sharp in the still air, carrying farther than he expected. Each strike sent a shiver through the wood, through the bones of the porch. He worked slowly, measuring twice before cutting, making sure the new board fit tight against the riser. As he worked, a car slowed on the street. He didn't look up until it passed, but he could feel the eyes inside, maybe curious, maybe just surprised to see someone working on a place that had been left to sag into itself for so long. He was used to that kind of glance, the one that weighed you against whatever story they'd already heard. By noon, the step was in place. He stood back, testing it with his weight. It held firm. A small thing, maybe, but it changed the way he saw the whole porch. He could stand on it without watching where his feet went. The work left his hands raw, the skin across his knuckles tight from the cold. He went inside, washed them in warm water, and caught sight of himself in the kitchen window, the faint stubble, the shadow under his eyes, but also something else. A steadiness that hadn't been there when he arrived. That afternoon, he sat on the repaired step with his coat pulled tight, sipping coffee from the same mug as that morning. The street was quiet except for the distant hum of a truck somewhere down by the grain elevator. A bird landed on the railing, tilted its head toward him, and stayed there longer than he expected. It wasn't much, just a step fixed, a bird lingering. But it felt like the first nail driven into something larger, the start of holding a thing together instead of watching it fall apart. He thought about the girl again, about the letter with no name, the dried flower. He wondered if she would notice the step. Maybe she would come by and sit on it without realizing it was new. Maybe she'd tell her grandmother. When the light began to fade, Daniel stayed out longer than usual. He watched the shadow of the house stretch across the yard, the frost returning to the grass in thin white threads. For the first time in months, the day had ended without the heaviness pressing in from every side. As he went inside, he caught himself glancing back at the step. It was just wooden nails, but it marked something invisible, a point where the idea of leaving had shifted into the thought of staying. Not forever. Not yet, but long enough to see what the next nail might hold. The frost clung stubbornly to the yard well into mid-morning, turning each blade of grass into a pale needle that crunched underfoot. Daniel had been outside since sunrise, carrying old boards from the shed and stacking them by the porch. He wasn't sure yet what they would become. Maybe a railing for the steps, maybe a planter box for spring, but the act of moving them felt like something in itself. The street was still. Only the faint rumble of a delivery truck 2 blocks over broke the quiet. Every so often, the cold would sharpen enough to make him draw his shoulders in, the breath from his nose turning to steam that hung in the air before drifting away. He was sweeping sawdust off the porch when he heard it, a voice, light but clear, coming from near the side fence. "Looks better," it said. He turned. On the other side of the weathered slats stood an elderly man, wrapped in a thick wool coat that looked like it had been worn through more than a few winters. His hands rested on the top of the fence, the knuckles swollen and pale. Daniel didn't answer right away. Words didn't come easily these days, and the habit of holding them back was still strong. Instead, he gave a short nod, as if the motion might carry enough acknowledgement on its own. The man's gaze moved toward the porch step. That board was bad for years. Surprised it didn't give way under someone. Daniel glanced down at it. The fresh wood already dusted with a faint frost, edges sharp against the weathered grain of the rest of the porch. "Figured it was time," he said finally, the words leaving his mouth slower than they had sounded in his head. The old man shifted his weight. "Name's Earl. Lived 3 houses down since '72. Saw the lights on here again, and thought maybe the place had life in it after all." There was no judgment in his tone, just a matter-of-factness. The way people in small towns spoke about things that had been abandoned too long. Daniel rested the broom against the railing. "Daniel," he said. Earl nodded, as if committing it to memory. "Place is good bones. Just need someone who doesn't mind the work." They stood like that for a moment, the silence between them not uncomfortable, just filled with the faint sounds of the day, a dog barking somewhere far off, the slow creak of the fence as Earl leaned against it. Then Earl reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. He slid it through the gap in the boards. "If you need tools or help lifting something heavy, give me a knock. My shed's got more than I'll ever use again." Daniel took it, the paper warm from being held in the man's hand. He looked down at the neat block lettering of an address and phone number. Earl tapped the fence once with his gloved hand, then turned to walk back toward his own yard. "Don't let it fall apart again," he called over his shoulder. Daniel stood there for a long moment after he was gone, the slip of paper in his palm, the broom still resting against the railing. He felt the quiet settle differently than it had before, not as a weight, but as something that could hold the sound of another voice. He tucked the note into the pocket of his jacket and went back to sweeping. The boards in the stack seemed less like scraps now and more like the start of something deliberate. He found himself picturing Earl's shed, the rows of tools, the smell of old oil and cedar. He hadn't thought about sharing work with anyone in a long time. By the time the sun slid toward the tops of the trees, the porch was clear and the stack of boards was neatly aligned. He sat on the repaired step, the same one Earl had noticed, and let the cold seep into his hands through the coffee mug he held. In the stillness, he imagined the sound of more voices, maybe children playing in the yard come spring, maybe the low murmur of a neighbor stopping by with a question. The thought didn't feel as foreign as it might have a week ago. When he finally went inside, the scrap of paper was still in his pocket. He left it there, knowing it would be the first thing he touched when he put the coat on again. The next morning, Daniel stood in the kitchen with his coffee cooling between his hands, staring at the frost painting the edges of the window. The slip of paper Earl had given him sat on the counter, its crease still holding the memory of the man's palm. It wasn't a big thing, not to anyone else. Just an offer to borrow a tool, maybe lift a heavy beam. But in Daniel's world, the one he'd been living in since he stepped off that bus into a town that felt smaller than his shadow, it was something that cracked the stillness. He thought about ignoring it. That was easier. Keep the board stacked on the porch, keep the work slow enough that it never needed a second pair of hands. But the image of Earl's shed had followed him into sleep, the way dust might follow sunlight through a window, quiet, persistent, impossible to keep out. By mid-morning, the frost had loosened, and the ground gave a muted crunch under his boots. He walked the 3 houses down, his breath puffing into the air like small, uncertain signals. Earl's place stood square against the street, paint dulled by decades, but still holding. The front steps were swept clean. He found the old man in the side yard, kneeling by a half-covered workbench. The smell of sawdust and oil was sharp in the cold air. Earl looked up, and the lines around his eyes deepened in what might have been a smile. "Didn't think I'd see you this soon," he said, straightening with a slow push of his knees. Daniel shrugged. "Figured I'd take you up on that offer. Got a few boards that could use more than a handsaw, each with its place, wrenches polished from use, a drill older than Daniel but still gleaming, clamps lined like soldiers at rest." Earl handed him a circular saw, its handle wrapped in worn leather. The occasional scrape of wood against wood, and the way Earl would hum low under his breath when a cut came out smooth. At one point, Daniel caught himself watching the old man's hands. The steadiness in them, the way they seemed to know exactly how much pressure to give, how to turn a board so the grain stayed true. It reminded him of working alongside his father in a different kind of shed, years before the war, years before loss had carved such deep channels inside him. When they finished, Earl leaned the saw against the bench. "You'll make that porch look like someone cares again," he said. Daniel nodded, feeling something in the words that was bigger than the wood they cut. "Appreciate it," he said, and meant it. On the walk back, the boards felt lighter on his shoulder. Not because they were any different in weight, but because he wasn't carrying them out of habit anymore. There was intent now, a shape forming in the air around him, as if the house could hear what he was bringing back to it. He set the boards on the porch and stood for a long while, listening to the faint creak of the railing in the wind. Inside, the room still felt too big for one person. But the silence didn't bite as hard. It had been stretched, thinned out by the morning's work. Later, as the day dimmed toward evening, he stepped onto the porch with a hammer in one hand. But in the way his shoulders settled after the last nail, Daniel felt the smallest thread of something new, or maybe something he'd thought was gone. Not joy, not yet, but a step toward meaning, the kind that comes from building something that might last. When night came, he left the porch light on, though no one was expected. The glow spilled onto the step, catching on the fresh edge of the board like a promise that even in a place worn down by years, there could be something made new. The porch light had burned through the night, casting its small pool of gold over the step. In the early hours, frost crept back across the grass, curling its fingers over the edge of the walkway. Daniel stood inside the front room, sipping coffee, watching the street through a narrow gap in the curtain. It was still and empty, the way mornings often were here, until a movement near the gate pulled his gaze. Someone was standing just beyond the fence, hands deep in their coat pockets. The posture was unfamiliar, but there was a patience in the way they lingered, as though they weren't deciding whether to come closer, but when. Daniel set the mug down, the sound of porcelain against which sharper than he meant. He stepped out onto the porch, boots quiet on the new board. The figure turned at the creak of the door, and the face resolved out of shadow. It was Ruth Callahan, the sister of his late wife. He hadn't seen her since the funeral, where her grief had been a wall no one could climb. Now her hair was tied back against the wind, and her eyes moved over the house like someone reading a letter they'd never finished. "Morning," Daniel said, his voice catching on the cold. She nodded, but didn't move from the gate. "Saw the light on last night. Thought maybe you'd finally decided this place was worth keeping." He didn't answer right away. Words were too easily misunderstood between them. Instead, he rested a hand on the porch post, the grain rough where paint had peeled. "Been making some repairs," he said finally. Ruth's gaze dropped to the new board, then to the stack of lumber against the wall. "Looks like it." They stood in the thin winter sunlight, neither willing to fill the quiet too fast. A car passed at the end of the street, its tires whispering over frost. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and went silent again. "I've been meaning to bring you something," she said after a moment. "Never got to mail it." He looked at it. No stamp, just his name in her handwriting, the curve of the letters pulling him back through years he'd tried to keep closed. "Why now?" he asked. Ruth's mouth tightened, because keeping it didn't feel right anymore. "And because I think she'd want you to read it here, not in some apartment 3 towns over." She turned then, walking back toward the gate without waiting for a reply. The latch clicked softly, and her footsteps faded down the sidewalk until only the low hum of the wind remained. Daniel stood in the yard, the envelope warm from her pocket against the chill in his hand. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he went back up the porch, sat in the chair by the door, and let the weight of it settle. The sun was climbing higher, sending a pale wash across the boards they'd cut yesterday. When he finally slid a finger under the flap, the paper inside crackled, a sound so small, yet it seemed to fill the space around him. The letter was short, a handful of lines, written in the uneven strokes she used when tired. She wrote of missing him, of hoping the house could be a place they might start over. She wrote about the little things she wanted to fix, the squeak in the stair, the stubborn drawer in the kitchen. And at the end, she wrote, "No matter what happens, promise me you'll keep the light on." He read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope. The words were a thread thrown backward in time. And for the first time since his return, he felt that the house was not just a reminder of what was gone, but also of what had been intended. That evening, he replaced the bulb on the porch with a brighter one. As darkness fell, the new light cut through the streets quiet, steady, and unflinching. Somewhere beyond its reach, life would keep moving. But here, for this small space, for this moment, there was something worth holding on to. The letter stayed on the small table by the window, the envelope weighed down by a chipped mug so the wind wouldn't shift it. Daniel didn't read it again, but every time he passed through the room, his eyes would catch on the curve of her handwriting. He'd never been the type to take words apart looking for hidden meanings, yet now, each line felt like it held more than it said. Not just what she wrote, but the silence in between. The next morning came slow and gray, clouds hanging low enough that the tops of the elms disappeared into them. He pulled on his coat and gloves, stepped out to the porch, and breathed in the scent of damp wood and cold earth. Somewhere across the street, someone was running a saw, the whine cutting through the stillness. He had work of his own to do. The north side of the house had taken the brunt of years without care, siding warped and splitting, paint flaking in strips that curled like dried leaves. He fetched the pry bar, set the ladder, and began peeling away what couldn't be saved. Hours passed without a word spoken. He measured, cut, and fitted new boards into the gaps. The sound of the hammer was steady, not hurried. Each nail driven in with a rhythm you could almost mistake for breathing. There was comfort in the repetition. Around midday, he set the hammer down and leaned back against the wall. Listening. No traffic, no voices, just the creak of the ladder in the light wind and the distant thump of someone closing a car door. He realized how much of the last few months had been filled with noise that didn't belong to him. Voices in courthouse hallways, the low hum of people whispering their judgments, the sharp click of heels on linoleum floors. Here, even in the absence of sound, he could feel space clearing inside him. When the clouds thinned briefly, sunlight fell over the yard, catching on the frost still clinging to the edges of the grass. Daniel took off his gloves, let the cold bite at his fingers, and brushed sawdust from his coat. The boards he'd replaced were pale and raw against the weathered siding, almost jarring in their newness. But he liked that. It meant the house wasn't just decaying, it was in the middle of becoming something else. By late afternoon, the smell of cut wood had settled in the air. He took a seat on the porch step, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. Across the street, Mrs. Atkins came out to check her mailbox, her small dog trailing behind. She gave a brief nod in his direction, not quite a greeting, more like an acknowledgement that he was still here. He thought about the letter again, about the line where she'd asked him to keep the light on. He had assumed, reading it the first time, that she meant it as something sentimental. But now, after a day spent in the quiet labor of keeping this place upright, it seemed like something more practical, as though she knew the light wasn't for her, but for whoever would need to find their way here later. Near dusk, he cleaned up the tools, stacking them neatly in the corner of the porch. He wiped down the hammer, coiled the extension cord, and draped the gloves over the railing to air out. Small acts, but they carried a weight, the kind of order you only bother with when you've decided a place is worth the trouble. Inside, the house was cool and shadowed. He filled the kettle, set on the stove, and stood by the window as it began to hum. Outside, the street lamps flickered on, one by one, their lights stretching over patches of frost. The new porch bulb burned steadily, just as it had the night before. He thought about making something to eat, but wasn't hungry. Instead, he sat at the table, pulled the envelope toward him, and turned it over in his hands. The paper was warm from where it had rested beneath the mug all day. He slid it back into place without opening it. In the quiet, he realized that the work on the house was no longer just about repairs. It was a way of answering her, not in words, but in the slow, deliberate proof that he had heard her, and that he intended to keep that promise. The boards, the paint, the light, they were all pieces of a conversation that didn't require either of them to be in the same room. The wind picked up outside, rattling the bare branches. Daniel leaned back, let the chair rest on two legs, and listened. The kettle clicked off, steady draft that curled along the floorboards and brushed his ankles when he walked through the hallway. Daniel had grown used to it. The way you grow used to an old ache, not by forgetting it's there, but by letting it belong. That evening, the sky pressed low and dark. The kind of dark that swallowed the shapes of things before the clock even reached 6. He'd lit the small lamp on the table, its light pooling in the center like a campfire in an empty field. The rest of the house sat in shadow. He was halfway through sanding a piece of trim for the kitchen window when it came. 3 knocks. Not hurried, not timid. Just there. They didn't echo. Didn't call for a quick answer. They settled into the air like something that knew it would be heard. For a moment, he didn't move. The sander hummed against the wood in his hand, and the dust drifted down to the floor. He clicked it off, the silence that followed almost heavier than the noise had been. Another knock. 2 this time. Shorter. He set the wood aside and brushed the dust from his shirt. The floor creaked under his boots as he crossed the room, each step measured. The front door had a small pane of glass at the top, sharp and damp. Then the figure stepped into the porch light, Harris from down the street. They'd spoken maybe twice since Daniel had moved back, once about the weather, once about the mailbox leaning to one side. Harris was older, built like the kind of man who had spent his life in work clothes. His face marked with lines that didn't seem to belong to any one emotion. Figured you might need this, Harris said, holding out a thermos. His voice was gravel, but there was no weight of expectation in it. Daniel hesitated, then took it. What's in it? Coffee. Hot enough, I think. It was a simple thing. Coffee in a thermos. But in a house where most days passed without a knock, without a voice speaking to him directly, it felt like something heavier. They stood there a moment, the light from the porch bulb pulling their shadows long over the steps. Harris nodded toward the siding Daniel had replaced. Looks good. You're making a dent in it. Daniel glanced at the boards. Still a long way to go. That's how it always is. Harris stepped back toward the yard, his boots crunching over the thin crust of frost. Anyway, you keep at it. No offer to come in. No lingering small talk. Just a nod, and then he was gone, the night folding over the space where he'd stood. Inside, Daniel poured the coffee into a chipped mug. It was strong, black, still steaming. He carried it to the window and stood there, letting the heat move through his hands. Across the street, Harris's porch light clicked on, then off again. The coffee wasn't just coffee. It was proof that someone else had thought of him without being asked. That someone had noticed the light in his window, the new boards on the wall. The man still working in the half-dark when most had gone in for the night. He drank it slowly, the bitterness grounding him in the quiet. When the mug was empty, he rinsed it, set it upside down on the drying rack, and looked once more toward the door. The knocks had left a faint echo in the air, not sound, but the kind of memory you feel in your chest. Later, when he went to bed, he left the porch light on, not just because of the letter, not just for her, but because now, maybe someone else might be walking by, might need to see it burning steady against the dark. The mailbox leaned slightly forward, as if it were trying to whisper something to the ground. Daniel had been meaning to fix it since the first week he came back, but it had stayed that way, crooked, holding the weathered paint of someone else's years. Most mornings, he didn't bother opening it. Bills could wait. Flyers went straight to the bin. But that morning, the frost clung to everything, even the thin metal latch. When he flipped it open, there wasn't the usual stack of folded papers. Just one envelope. No return address. The paper was thick, the kind that felt more like cardstock than mail. The steam from the coffee curled upward, and he slid his finger under the flap. The paper inside was folded once, neatly. The handwriting was careful, the kind of careful that came from trying to make each word matter. He read it twice before it fully settled in. It wasn't long, just a few lines. You don't know me, but I knew her. We met when she used to work at the diner near the highway. She talked about you, more than you might think. The ladder was still folded into the ceiling, dust lining the edges of the hatch. It wasn't that he didn't want to look. It was that the attic belonged to a part of the house still holding its breath. Every house has them, corners where dust settles not just because of time, but because of absence. He carried the letter into the living room, set it on the mantel. The fire wasn't lit, but the mantel still carried a faint smell of ash from weeks ago. He stood there a long time, looking at the folded paper, the way the light touched its edges. By afternoon, the sky had gone pale, almost white with thin strips of cloud. He pulled down the attic ladder, the wood groaning under its own weight. The air that came down with it was colder than the rest of the house, edged with the dry scent of insulation and cedar. He climbed slowly, the rungs stiff under his boots. The attic was low, just high enough to crouch. Shafts of light came through small gaps near the eaves, catching motes of dust in the air. The north corner was crowded with boxes, some collapsed in on themselves, others taped shut. He ran his hands along the beams, feeling for something loose. Behind the third rafter, tucked into the shadow, was a smaller box. Wooden, no lock. It was lighter than he expected. Inside, beneath a folded scrap of linen, was a photograph, black and white, edges curled. She was in it, leaning against the porch post of the same house, hair pinned back, smiling toward someone just outside the frame. Beneath the photo, a single dog tag. His name. The chain coiled like it had been there for years. He sat back on his heels, the dust rising in small clouds. The attic felt different now, not just empty, but holding something. Not just a space, but a message that had waited quietly without demanding to be found. When he climbed down, the box in hand, the air in the house felt warmer. He set it on the table, the photograph leaning against the thermos Harris had brought 2 nights ago. Outside, the light was fading again, but he didn't reach for the lamp yet. He let the room sit in that in-between, not quite day, not quite night, the way you let a thought linger before you speak it. The letter still lay on the mantel. He didn't move it. Some things, he thought, needed to stay where they were for a while before you decided what to do next. That night, Daniel didn't sleep much. Every so often, a draft slipped through the kitchen window, nudging the corner of the photograph so that it shifted just slightly, as though trying to draw his attention again. By morning, frost had glazed the windows, and the fields beyond the backyard had the muted silver of early winter. He wrapped his hands around a mug of coffee, standing at the table, looking at the face in the picture. There was something about her smile, a tilt of the head. He turned the photo over. In faint pencil, near the bottom right corner, was a name he hadn't seen in years, Jonas Weller. And beneath it, a date. Not the day they'd taken the picture, but a week before his last deployment. He knew Jonas. Everyone in town did. Jonas had been the kind of man people stopped to talk to on the street, even if they were already late. He had worked odd jobs, knew how to fix anything, and always had a story about the old days. Jonas had also been close to her, maybe too close. Daniel sat down, the chair legs scraping lightly on the floor. He didn't want to think about Jonas, but the name was a thread, and once you saw a loose thread, it was hard not to pull. By mid-morning, he put on his coat and walked the short distance into town. The air was sharp, his breath coming out in small clouds. Storefronts stood with their lights on, the kind of warm yellow that made the glass look like it was holding the day at bay. At the far end of Main Street, there was a diner with a sign that still hummed faintly from the old neon tubing. Inside, it smelled of coffee and bacon grease, the booths worn smooth by years of elbows and conversations. Daniel sat at the counter, the stool wobbling slightly under him. A waitress he didn't know poured him coffee without asking. Her hair was tied back in a red scarf, her eyes quick, but not unkind. "Been a while since we've seen you in here," she said. More observation than welcome. He nodded, but didn't answer right away. His eyes wandered to the far corner table. It was small, 2 chairs pressed close together. The laminate top scratched with years of initials and rings from coffee cups. That was where Jonas used to sit, always facing the door, as if he needed to be the first to know who came in. The waitress followed his gaze. "You knew him, didn't you?" "Jonas Weller." Daniel's hand tightened around the mug. "A long time ago." She nodded slowly, as though weighing whether to go on. He used to talk about her. Said she could brighten a place, even when it was already lit up. You should have seen the way he'd look at the door every time it opened, like maybe she'd walk in. Daniel's stomach turned, but not from the coffee. The words settled heavy, confirming a suspicion he hadn't wanted to name. On the walk back home, the cold felt sharper. It was as if the house itself had decided it was time. By the time he reached the porch, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose edge of the screen door. He paused. Outside, the wind carried the smell of snow. He sat in the old armchair, letting the warmth touch his hands, and thought about the attic, the letter, the name in pencil. He knew he couldn't ignore it, whether he wanted to or not. Jonas Weller was now part of the story he'd been left with, a story he hadn't asked to inherit, but one he'd have to decide how to carry. The fire burned low, and the shadows in the room stretched long across the floor. Daniel stayed there until only the embers were left, the photograph smile still catching the faintest light. The next morning began without a sunrise. A low gray sky pressed down over the hills, turning the air flat and heavy. Daniel stood at the kitchen window with his second cup of coffee, watching the bare branches sway in the wind. The photograph was still on the mantel, angled slightly toward the chair where he had sat most of last night. It felt as if the house was waiting for him to make the next move. He had never been the sort of man to go digging into the past, not because he was afraid of it, but because he had always believed that the past had teeth. If you disturbed it, it bit back. Still, Jonas Weller's name wouldn't let go of him. It sat in his mind like a pebble in a boot. Small, but impossible to ignore. By mid-morning, he decided to look through the rest of the attic. The narrow stairs groaned under his weight, and each step stirred up the faint scent of dust and cedar. The air up there had the stillness of a place that had been sealed too long, not abandoned exactly, just patient. He started with a corner he hadn't touched before. Boxes were stacked 3 high, each one sagging at the sides. Some were labeled in faded marker: winter, kitchen, miscellaneous. Others had no markings at all. In one unmarked box, he found a stack of letters bundled with string. The envelopes were yellowed, their corners soft from handling. The postmarks were from years he recognized, the years he'd been gone. The handwriting wasn't hers, but it was familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. He didn't open them. Not yet. It was the kind of mark left by a chair, a single rectangle of space where nothing had settled. Someone had once sat there, maybe often, looking out toward the fields. From that vantage, you could see the road leading into town. You could see who was coming. Back in the kitchen, he placed the bundle of letters on the table. The temptation to read them was strong, the steady rhythm of the axe grounding him. He mended the loose hinge on the back door. Around mid-afternoon, he boiled potatoes for supper. Each act was ordinary, but it filled the silence without chasing it away. When evening came, snow began to fall, slow, deliberate flakes that seemed in no hurry to reach the ground. He lit the fire again and took the photograph from the mantel, holding in his lap as he sat. The smile in the picture no longer looked like it was just for him. He thought about Jonas sitting at that corner table in the diner, about the boots in the attic, about the chair by the window facing the road. Pieces of a story were revealing themselves, but in a language that demanded patience. That night, he placed the photograph back on the mantel and the bundle of letters in the drawer by his bed. Not to hide them, just to keep them close, like questions he wasn't ready to ask out loud. Before sleeping, he stood for a moment at the kitchen doorway, listening to the faint creaks and sighs of the old house settling into the cold. It almost felt like it was listening back. The snow kept falling through the night, whispering against the windows like someone too polite to knock. By morning, the yard was a blank sheet. The woodpile half buried, the fence lines softened under the white. Daniel woke before dawn, the kind of waking where you know sleep isn't coming back, no matter how tightly you close your eyes. He lay still for a while, listening to the muffled quiet that comes after a heavy snow. It was the kind of silence that didn't just sit in the room, it pressed in on you, filled the spaces between thoughts. Eventually, he swung his legs out of bed and padded to the kitchen, his breath visible in the chill before the stove was lit. On the table, the bundle of letters waited, the string holding them together as if to say, "Not yet." He poured himself a cup of coffee, black and too hot, and stood looking at them. There was no reason today should be the day, but there was no reason it shouldn't be either. He untied the knot slowly, the string leaving faint lines in the paper where it had pressed for years. The top letter had a postmark from late autumn, 3 years ago. The handwriting was steady but unadorned, the kind of script you learn young and never bother to change. He recognized it now, Jonas Weller. The paper inside was soft from age, the ink faded in places where it had been folded too long. "Daniel, I don't know if this will reach you. Your sister said you were still deployed, and I don't want to cause trouble, but I think you should know the house is starting to fall in on itself. Your uncle's repairs won't hold much longer, and Mary Ann's been saying it's not worth saving. She means well, but she's tired. You'd understand if you saw her eyes lately. There's history in these walls, Daniel. Yours. Mine. The kind you don't get back if you let it go." He stopped there, letting the words settle. The coffee had gone cold in his hand, but he didn't drink it. Jonas had known the house mattered, maybe more than Daniel himself had, back then. He read on. "If you ever get the chance, come back before the snow. Things look different when the ground's still green. Maybe you'll remember what this place was. Maybe you'll decide it's worth the work. I'd help if you asked." The letter ended without a signature. Just a small ink blot in the corner where the pen had hesitated. Daniel set it down carefully, as though the paper might crumble. Outside, the snow was still coming, heavier now, blurring the line between the fields and the sky. He thought of Jonas sitting at that attic window, the boots beside his chair, watching the road for someone who never came. The thought carried a weight that wasn't grief exactly, more like a recognition that some people keep watch even when they know the door will stay closed. All day, while he fed logs into the stove until the kitchen walls held a faint heat. That evening, he put the letter back in its envelope and returned it to the bundle. The string went back around, the knot tied with care, not because he wanted to put it away, but because some things deserved to be kept whole until the right moment. Before bed, he stepped out onto the porch. The snow had stopped, and the moon laid its pale light over everything, turning the yard into a quiet ocean. His breath hung in the air, then disappeared. Somewhere in that silence, Daniel woke to the faint groan of the old beams above his bed. The house had a way of talking, not in words, but in small, persistent sounds that reminded you it was alive. By the time he rose, the sun had edged over the ridge behind the orchard, throwing pale light across the frost that clung to every blade of grass. His boots crunched through the thin crust of ice as he crossed the yard, passing the half-fallen shed. He stopped for a moment, thinking about how Jonas must have stood here too. Maybe on mornings like this, with his collar turned up against the cold, watching his breath mingle with the smoke from the chimney. He needed to know what had happened to Jonas, hitting the wooden sidewalks with a sound like slow ticking. Daniel walked past the diner, the post office, the hardware store that still had Christmas lights in the window though it was February. He hadn't planned on speaking to anyone, but the search took him to the one place he couldn't avoid, the barber shop. Mr. Carlson had been cutting hair in the same chair since before Daniel was born. The smell of talc and old leather hit him as soon as he stepped inside. The single bulb above the counter cast a warm circle, catching the dust that floated in the air. Carlson looked up, scissors in hand. "Haven't seen you in a long while," he said, his voice steady, as though the years hadn't been measured by wars or funerals, just by haircuts missed. Daniel didn't waste words. "I'm looking for Jonas Weller." Carlson's hand slowed, the scissors still open. "Jonas." He said it like tasting something sour. "Moved out of the old Weller place, must be 2 winters back. Health went downhill after his sister passed." "Where'd he go?" Carlson hesitated, eyes narrowing the way people do when they're measuring how much of the truth you can stand. The air colder now that he knew Jonas wasn't just a name on a letter, but a man still breathing somewhere nearby. The walk to Mill Creek took most of the afternoon. The road curved along the frozen banks, the sound of water rushing under thin ice breaking the otherwise perfect silence. He passed bare fields, rusted tractors, a scarecrow leaning forward as if listening. The home was a low building with wide windows, its paint faded by years of sun and snow. Inside, it smelled faintly of soap and boiled vegetables. A woman at the front desk gave Daniel a polite, practice smile. "I'm here to see Jonas Weller," he said. She checked a list, then nodded toward a small lounge where a few residents sat watching an old black-and-white movie. Jonas was there, in a chair by the window, the light pooling on his lap. He was smaller than Daniel remembered, or maybe Daniel had just imagined him larger from the way people used to speak of him. For a while, Daniel didn't approach. He stood near the doorway, watching the old man's hands resting still on his knees, the veins like thin blue rivers. Outside the window, snow began to fall again, soft and slow. When he finally walked over, Jonas looked up. His eyes were clouded, but there was recognition, not of Daniel as he was now, but of someone he might have been long ago. "You came?" Jonas said quietly, as if continuing a conversation they'd started years before. Daniel sat down, the old chair creaking beneath him. "I read your letter." Jonas's gaze drifted past him to the snow. They spoke in fits and starts, the way two people do when time has carved distance between them. Jonas told him about the winters after Daniel left, about how the orchard trees had stopped blooming, about the day Marianne stopped coming by the house altogether. His voice thinned when he spoke of the attic, and Daniel realized that for Jonas, the house had been more than wood and nails. It had been the last place where things still made sense. As the daylight faded, Daniel knew he couldn't leave it at this one visit. There was more to learn, more to piece together, if he was ever going to understand why the house mattered so much, and why Jonas had believed Daniel might be the one to save it. When he left, Jonas didn't ask him to come back, but his eyes followed Daniel to the door in a way that made the request unnecessary. The walk home was darker, the snow deeper under his boots. He carried the image of Jonas in that chair, the quiet in the room, the way the snow outside seemed to slow time. In that stillness, Daniel felt something shift, not enough to call it hope, but enough to know he'd start again tomorrow. The next morning began without a sunrise. The clouds hung low, thick with snow that hadn't yet decided to fall. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the wood worn smooth by decades of elbows leaning there, coffee cooling in front of him. Jonas's words from yesterday circled in his head like a slow, unbroken current, but filled with the muted hum of things settled in their places, the faint rattle of a window pane in the wind, the soft ticking of the clock over the sink. He tried to eat a piece of toast, but the bread tasted dry, like it had been sitting out for days. By mid-morning, he put on his coat and gloves and stepped outside. The yard looked the same as it had yesterday. And the day before, brittle grass poking through patches of snow, the skeletal limbs of the apple trees stretched toward the gray sky. But something in him had shifted. He could no longer walk past the sagging roof of the shed without feeling the weight of Jonas's voice. The ladder was still leaning against the side of the house from weeks ago, when he tried to clear a gutter and abandoned the job halfway through. He carried it to the shed, boots crunching against the frozen ground, and steadied it against the weathered boards. The climb was slower than he remembered it being years ago, his knees stiff, the wood cold under his hands. From the roof of the shed, he could see the whole property, the curve of the fence, the orchard beyond it, the road disappearing into the trees. He thought about Jonas sitting in that chair at the home, looking out at snow that wasn't his land, at a world that no longer carried his weight. The shingles were worse than he'd expected, some curled, others missing entirely. He knelt there for a long moment, snow beginning to dust his shoulders, and thought about how easy it was for a place to fall apart when no one was watching. When he climbed down, he didn't go back inside. Instead, he crossed the yard to the orchard. The trees stood in uneven rows, the earth around them hardened and bare. He ran a gloved hand over the rough bark of one trunk, remembering the summers when he was a boy and the branches were so heavy with fruit they seemed to bow toward the ground. Jonas had said the orchard stopped blooming. Daniel wondered if trees could feel abandonment the way people did. He stayed there until his hands grew numb, then headed back inside. The kitchen smelled faintly of the coffee he'd left untouched. He sat again at the table, this time pulling Jonas's letter from his coat pocket. He read it slowly, tracing each word with his eyes as though they might rearrange themselves and give him more than they already had. In the afternoon, he found himself in the attic. The pull-down ladder groaned as it unfolded, and a fine drift of dust rained down. He climbed carefully, the air growing colder with each step, until his head rose into the dim space above. The attic was low and wide, the rafters blackened with age. Light leaked in through a small round window, catching motes of dust that hung in the air. The handwriting was small, careful, and unmistakably Jonas's. Dates ran down the left margin, and beside them, notes about the orchard, the weather, the repairs the house had needed. There were gaps, months with nothing written, as if life had simply stopped for a while. Daniel sat there on the attic floor, the cold seeping through his jeans, reading until the light began to fade. The ledgers weren't just records. They were pieces of a life lived in this house, years layered like the dust on the rafters. By the time he closed the trunk, darkness had settled over the property. He climbed down the attic ladder slowly, carrying one of the ledgers under his arm. That night, he built a fire in the old wood stove. The flames caught slowly, and read about a summer 15 years ago when the orchard had yielded more apples than Jonas knew what to do with. He'd given baskets to the neighbors, left crates on the church steps, pressed cider until his hands ached. Daniel could almost see it, the house alive with the smell of apples, the porch filled with crates, the laughter of people coming and going. Daniel sat there until the fire burned low, the ledger warm against his hands. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew he would go back to see Jonas. And he knew this house was not done with him. For the first time in months, he didn't dread the next day. The snow finally came overnight, soft at first, then thick enough to bury the brittle grass and quiet the road. By morning, the world beyond Daniel's window was white and still, the kind of stillness that felt older than the house itself. He stood there for a while, coffee in one hand, the ledger from the attic in the other. The cover was worn smooth where his thumb had rubbed it over and over during the night. Daniel ran his finger over it before tucking the book in his coat pocket. He wasn't entirely sure why he felt the need to take it back to Jonas, only that the thought of leaving it here felt wrong. The drive into town was slow. The old truck groaned in the cold, tires crunching over the snow-packed road. Bare branches arched overhead like bones, their tips etched with frost. Every so often, thinking about the lines in the ledger, the neat notes about pruning schedules, weather patterns, and the yield from each row of apple trees. Those words were more than records. They were Jonas's voice, speaking in a way that didn't ask for a reply. When he reached the care home, the parking lot was nearly empty. A thin trail of footprints led from the main doors to where the snowplow had left a ridge of ice. Inside, the air smelled faintly of oatmeal and antiseptic. The receptionist nodded when he asked for Jonas and pointed toward the common room at the end of the hall. Jonas was there, as if he'd been waiting all morning, though Daniel knew better. Daniel crossed the room without hurry and placed the ledger on the small table between them. Jonas glanced at it, then up at Daniel. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a slow, measuring calm. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and looked past Daniel, out at the snow drifting beyond the window. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jonas said, "That house will give you more than it takes, if you let it." Daniel didn't answer. The room felt warm compared to the winter outside. But there was a different kind of chill inside him, the kind that came from not knowing whether you were meant to hold on to something or let it go. Jonas's thumb moved over the ledger's edge. Everything I wrote in there, I wrote because I didn't want to forget. Not just the work, the weather, the trees, but the years themselves. People think you remember the big things, but you don't. You remember the way the light came through the kitchen window on the day you decided to paint the porch. You remember the smell of apples when you couldn't sell them fast enough. You remember the sound of someone else's footsteps in the hall. Daniel thought of the silence in the house these past weeks. The way each room seemed to hold its breath when he walked in. He thought of the orchard, bare and brittle, and wondered if he could give it life again. Jonas finally opened the ledger, flipping to a page near the middle. This one, he said, tapping the paper, was the year the frost came late. Thought it was going to kill everything. But the trees bloomed anyway. Not as much as before, but enough. He closed the book and slid it a little closer to Daniel. "You'll figure out what to do." They sat like that for a while. The ledger between them, like a bridge, neither of them was in a hurry to cross. The snow outside thickened, swirling against the glass. When Daniel left, the ledger was back in his coat pocket. Jonas didn't ask when he'd come again, and Daniel didn't promise anything. But as he stepped outside into the cold, he felt the weight of the book in his coat, solid against his side. On the drive home, he pulled over once, just before the bend where the river widened. The snow-covered orchard lay in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It looked small from here, almost fragile. Back at the house, he lit the stove and set the ledger on the kitchen table. He left his coat on, sitting there in the dim afternoon light, looking at the book but not opening it. He thought about Jonas's words, about giving the house a chance to give back. For the first time, the idea didn't feel impossible. The house woke early, not because Daniel set an alarm, but because winter light slipped in through the thin curtains and touched the floor like a careful hand. He stared at the ceiling for a while, listening to the stove tick as last night's embers gave themselves up. The ledger lay on the chair beside the bed, the cover slightly warped from years and weather. He could have opened it and read until the day felt mapped and manageable. Instead, he swung his legs to the cold and let the floor speak first. In the kitchen, he filled a dented kettle, set it on the stovetop, and stood with both palms on the counter while the metal warmed. The window above the sink held a narrow view of the orchard, just enough to show the slope and the first row of trees. Snow clung to the lower limbs. The higher branches were etched clean, black lines against a pale sky. Steam began to lift from the kettle. He poured the water over ground coffee and waited, not for the taste, but for the small ceremony of it. The paper darkening, the drips slowing, the way warmth moved through the room by degrees. He took the first sip standing, the second at the back door with his boots on, the third already out in the yard, cup tucked into his glove, breath ghosting the air. The garden shed door rasped open after 2 tries. The hinges complained in a voice he recognized. "You're late, but come in anyway." Inside, the smell was a stubborn braid of old oil, cedar shavings, and damp rope. He found a handsaw where someone had left it long ago. Jonas, probably, judging by the way a strip of cloth had been wrapped around the grip to keep it from slipping. There were pruning loppers, rust on the bolts, a coil of twine, a bucket scabbed over with paint the color of weathered bone. He carried what he could, set it beside the fence, went back for more. Work made a small pile at his feet, tools like short sentences waiting to be tried. At the first tree, he stopped. Up close. The branches looked like a crowd of arms lifted to ask for something he wasn't sure he could give. A bird had left a single footprint on the snow-packed ground by the trunk. The mark looked delicate and certain at once. He set the cup down and pulled off one glove to test the twig. It snapped cleanly, the sound shy but decisive. He lifted the loppers and began with what he knew from other lives. Cut away the dead, crossed the break where 2 branches scraped and bled each other raw. Opened the center, so light could find its way in. The first cut trembled. The second didn't. By the fourth, his breath and the motion settled into each other. He moved tree to tree, not in a straight line, but in a pattern his feet invented, skipping the ones that felt too complicated for mourning, circling back to anything that seemed to ask twice. He flipped the ledger open only once to check a small drawing Jonas had made years ago, a simple diagram of how a young branch learns to carry fruit if you give it space. The penciled lines were faint, smudged by time. Still, they held. He kept the book in his coat pocket, not as a rule, but as a reassurance. Every so often he touched it like a man checks for his keys before closing a door. Late morning thinned to a gray midday. Snow softened under the weak sun, the crust giving with each step a quiet, satisfying hush. He shrugged out his coat, hung it on a low branch, and worked in his sweater until the cold folded its arms and waited. When his hands grew stupid, he returned to the kitchen for another cup and a slice of bread with butter that refused to spread. He ate by the sink, standing again, watching a red-tailed hawk tilt against the wind above the far hill. There was no need to think beyond the next branch, the next knot to cut clean, the next short bundle of dead wood to stack along the fence for burning later. In the afternoon, he took up the wire and walked the line where the fence had sagged. The posts leaned like old men at a bus stop, resigned and companionable. He tamped the earth with the heel of his boot, cinched the wire with a slow, steady twist. Listened for the low music of tension coming back. A memory rose, not from war, but from a summer when he helped a neighbor mend a fence after a storm. They hadn't talked much then either. The work had told them what to do, and at the end of the day, the field held its shape again. He felt that shape now, faint and promising. Toward evening, clouds gathered unevenly along the western edge of the valley. He could smell snow in the air, dry, metallic, the way a pocket of pennies smells after rain. He went back to the shed for a 5-gallon bucket, then to the corner of the yard where a pile of straw had sat since fall. He spread straw in a thin ring around the youngest trunks. Not a guarantee of survival, just a hedge against the kind of cold that takes without warning. He worked until his fingers complained, then blew on them and kept working. He did not think about the way the house had seemed empty when he first opened the door, the echo that followed him from room to room. He did not think about names spoken in churches or doctors' offices, names that had become soft from being handled too often. He didn't need to think about those things because the orchard had given him tasks with edges. Cut here, tie there, lift this, set that down. The mind made room for those edges. Grief obeyed for an hour or two, stepping back as if reminded it was not the only voice in the room. By dusk, the first row looked different. Not improved exactly. He didn't trust that word, but clearer, less frantic, like someone had opened a window in a stale room. He gathered the cut branches into one tidy pile. The motion scratched a slow rhythm into his back and shoulders, a useful kind of soreness that promised sleep later. He stood for a long minute with his hands on his hips, looking down the slope. The trees didn't thank him. They didn't have to. Their silence felt less like absence and more like agreement. Inside, he set his boots on a mat and knocked snow from the cuffs of his jeans. The stove took wood and caught quickly. He warmed his hands over the open door and watched the kindling go from pale to amber red. On the table, he opened the ledger again. He dated the top of a blank page, the number small, almost apologetic. He wrote a single line, pruned the first row. Light moves better now. He paused, then added, wire tightened along south fence. Straw at young trunks. cold holding steady. That was all. He closed the book and rested his palm on it, letting the warmth from the stove widen under his skin. A quiet settled that wasn't empty. He washed the cup and left it to dry upside down. He ran water into a pot, added rice and a pinch of salt, set it to simmer. While it cooked, he moved through the house without turning on any more lights. He straightened a picture frame that had hung crooked since the day he arrived. He folded a blanket at the end of the couch, smoothed the fabric with a flat hand. He paused at the front door and opened a crack. In the dark, the orchard was more felt than seen, a black shape with a breath of its own. Snow began again, light, half-hearted, as if winter had something left to say but had forgotten the words. He stood there, letting the cold lean against his cheeks. He realized, with a clarity that surprised him, that no one was coming to tell him what the next day should be. No letters would arrive with instructions. No voice would offer absolution. The ledger was not a manual. Only a record of attention paid over time. He could pay attention. He could keep showing up. He closed the door and ate at the stove, bowl held close to his chest. The heat moved through him the way gratitude sometimes does, unannounced, unsteady, but real. When the bowl was empty, he rinsed it, dried it, and placed it in the cabinet. He turned the stove damper to low and carried the ledger back to the bedroom. Before sleep, he stood at the window. The orchard lay patient beneath the new snow, branches catching what light remained. He thought of Jonas by the window at the care home, of the thumb worn smooth by years of pages. He thought of a hawk turning above a hill, the fence line humming, the clean break of a dead twig. The day had not healed him. It had only asked for his hands and returned to shape to an hour. It would be enough to try again tomorrow. He let the curtain fall and laid down with the ledger on the chair, exactly where it had been when morning found him. Outside, the snow stitched the yard to the road to the field to the hill. Somewhere in that quiet seam, meaning was not discovered so much as made, one small cut, one knot, one line on a page at a time. He began before the sun, in the gray hour that asks for soft hands and no sudden moves. The house was quiet but not asleep, wood settling, old pipes clearing their throats. The faintest scrape of tree limbs easing along the eaves. Daniel filled a basin and wiped the long farmhouse table until the grain lifted under the rag like a map rising from water. He set the ledger in the middle, not as a trophy, but as a guest, and marked the page with a strip of red cloth cut from a frayed shirt sleeve. A small candle went beside it, unlit for now. There would be light enough later. He moved through the rooms with a patient rhythm, dusting the window sashes, straightening the quilts, carrying a stack of extra chairs from the shed and lining them against the wall as if rehearsing arrivals. On the mantel he placed 3 objects that seemed, without planning, to belong together. A smooth river stone, a brass button found beneath the porch steps, and a little tin of orchard tags he had uncovered in the drawer of Jonas's desk. The button still held a thread of dull green cloth. He pressed it flat between finger and thumb, then let it go. By mid-morning he had a pot on the stove, onions surrendering to oil, the kitchen filling with the kind of smell that climbs a person's shoulders and loosens them. He added carrots, celery, a handful of barley. While the soup considered itself, he mixed flour, warm water, yeast. The dough took shape in the bowl like a useful idea, sticky at first, then compliant, then eager under his palms. He left it to rise on the back of the stove and stepped outside to sweep the porch. The broom's bristles found old leaves tucked along the baseboard and a drab stack of wind-blown flyers wedged behind the mailbox. He cleared cobwebs from the corner post and rubbed a thumb across the tarnished door knocker until the metal showed memory of shine. The porch light got a new bulb. He tested it once and let it be. He strung no banners, hung no signs. A clean threshold would say the most. Around noon, Ruth's truck rolled up the lane and stopped short of the steps. She climbed down with a casserole wrapped in a clean towel, the kind of dish that had more history than recipe. He met her halfway, and for a moment they simply exchanged weight, her offering into his hands, a small nod in return. "For the table," she said, barely above the sway of winter air. He gestured toward the door. She shook her head, "Not yet," and patted his sleeve. The towel held a square of heat that warmed his palm long after she drove away. Others came in their own time. Mr. Alden with a basket of apples that tasted like October under the skin. Elise with a round loaf brushed with egg, the crust a deep, glossy brown that shone even in the hallway's thin light. A teenager from the feed store carried in a galvanized bucket filled with pine boughs and stuck them into an old crock by the staircase, so the house could remember how a forest smells. People set things down the way they used to set their grief in church, carefully, without performance, trusting the table to hold. He kept the front door on the hook so it wouldn't swing wide. And he let the day make its own invitations. No speeches, no introductions. He pointed to the corner for coats, lifted lids, ladled soup, and fetched extra bowls from the lower cabinet. When someone reached for the ledger, they did it the way a person touches a sleeping child. Fingers gentle on the edge, eyes moving slowly along the pages. He did not stand over them. He let the book explain itself. The radio in the kitchen found a station playing standards from a time before any of them were here. The volume stayed low, the melody threading in and out of conversation without asking to be noticed. A child, Elise's nephew, maybe, sat cross-legged by the stove with a blunt pencil and drew trees that looked a lot like rockets until the page turned sideways and the orchard returned to itself. Now, and then someone stepped onto the porch with a mug to let the air reset them, to check the sky for more weather, to look down the road as if another guest might be approaching with a story the rest of them had forgotten to bring. Daniel hovered near the threshold between rooms, not quite in the circle, not apart. He carried bread to the table, broke it as he set it down, so no one had to be the first. He refilled the pot and watched steam lift, wash the window, slide away in a fogged oval that took a second to clear. He noticed small things he would keep later. The way Ruth tucked a loose wisp of hair behind her ear before reaching for the ladle. The way Alden tipped his head to listen with his whole spine. The way Elise's hand flattened on the open page of the ledger as if to keep something from flying up and out. He had placed an extra chair at the end of the table without planning to. No one sat there. Now, and then a hand rested briefly on the back of that chair as people moved past. An almost gesture, like the way folks touch a stone at a grave, without quite knowing why they reached. Before he lit the candle, he stood a second with the match between finger and thumb, struck it once, and set the flame to the wick. The light took in a small circle. Faces leaned toward it, then away as if acknowledging something private. No one said what. They didn't need to. As afternoon settled toward its softer half, the house filled and thinned in cycles. Someone brought a thermos of cider and left it by the stove. Someone else unearthed a stack of linen napkins from a drawer and arranged them like sails by the breadboard. Threaded comments rose, a few memories of Jonas pruning too late in the season. A mention of a storm that year, the creek jumped the road. A quick recollection of a school fair held in the orchard when the trees were young, and he still had knees that liked ladders. The talk stayed practical and small, the way good weather stays without announcement. What surprised him most was not the number of people, or the food, or the low music that found its way under and over things. It was how often a hand reached for work without being asked. A plate carried to the sink, a log added to the stove, a chair shifted to make space for an older woman's knees. The house learned the new arrangement of its furniture by listening to the bodies inside it. He could feel the walls take this in, as if the wood decided to keep the memory of each considerate turn. Midway through the evening, when the sky outside had pulled the last of the color into itself and begun to think about stars, the door eased open and a wind moved briefly through the hallway, touching shoulders and lifting the fringe on the rug. It carried cold and a thin thread of wood smoke from some other chimney. Daniel felt it cross his face, and for a heartbeat, a row of desert tints lifted in his mind, a brightness under canvas as men turned toward heat in another country. The picture came and went without hurting him. He watched his breath leave him and not return and understood with simple certainty that he had not been left behind here to keep watch alone. The orchard called in its own way. Between refilling bowls and listening to mentions of weather, he stepped out to the porch and looked down the slope. The trees stood with a different posture than morning gave them. The cuts he'd made were invisible in the dark, but the spacing, the air, felt readable. He could believe that light would find its way in when the season turned. He could believe, too, that the work of tending people was not so different from opening a crown for new growth, that both asked for restraint and a willingness to endure the ugly stage before the beauty. When he re-entered the kitchen, Alden was standing by the window with the ledger open to a page Daniel hadn't reached yet. The old man closed it gently, kept a finger on the place, and looked out into the night. Daniel stood beside him and matched his stance. They stayed like that, two men shaped by separate wars, listening to soup simmer and chair legs shift. sharing a silence that wasn't empty. The candle guttered once and steadied. Near the end, when coats were pulled from hooks and lids found their original pots, Ruth placed a loaf pan on the sill to cool and pressed her palm to the ledger's cover as if to check its temperature. She tucked a folded note under the ribbon without ceremony. He would read it later, 3 lines in her tight librarian's hand telling him the library had a wall with a persistent leak and a need for a steady pair of shoulders. If he ever felt like giving a few hours on Tuesdays, he slid the note under the candle holder so it wouldn't drift away in a draft. A purpose can be as small as a Tuesday, he thought, and as faithful. When the last tail lights disappeared at the bend, the house sighed the way a field does when the wind changes. He washed dishes without hurry, stacking bowls in a clean tower and drying them with a good towel. He set the ledger back at the table's center and, after a moment, pulled it toward him. He wrote more than usual. Door open from noon to night. Neighbors came with food and not much talk. The rooms held. He paused, then added, an extra chair stayed empty. Still, the place felt full. Prune trees readier for light. So maybe. He blew out the candle and watched the smoke travel. Up first, then sideways, a gray slip of ribbon dissolving against the ceiling. At the door he stood, hand on the new bulb switch, and let the porch light spill down the steps and across the first patch of snow-crusted yard. The beam reached far enough to touch the nearest tree, then gave up. That, too, was enough. He left the light burning, not as a beacon, not as a promise, only as a statement. Here is a house that remains awake for a while after company leaves. In the hallway, the pine boughs had warmed and opened, their scent stretching along the stair like a green line towards sleep. He followed it up, step by careful step, feeling the day's weight in his legs. The kind that tells a person they have belonged to the hours and the hours have belonged to them. Tomorrow would bring whatever weather it liked. He would wake. He would look at the trees. He would make a list. He would pour coffee and let the first light speak first. Morning came in a way that didn't ask permission. No storm, no grand colors, just a pale seam opening between earth and sky. Daniel woke before the alarm, lying still a moment to hear the house breathe. The creak of the joist above his bed, the distant hush of wind slipping past the chimney, the faint shiver of branches against the glass. It was the kind of quiet that carried weight, the kind you almost feared breaking. He swung his legs over the side and felt the cold floorboards wake his feet. Downstairs, the embers in the stove had gone dull and red, the kind of heat you could touch if you were foolish. He knelt, stirred them gently, added 2 split logs from the basket. The fire hesitated, then found itself, threads of orange knitting together until the stove hummed again. That sound, low and steady, had always reminded him of a tent heater from years back, the kind that made you forget for a few hours you were in a place you'd rather not be. The ledger still sat in the center of the table, closed now. A thin layer of flour dust still clinging to its cover from the bread he'd made yesterday. Beside it, the candle had burned down to a shallow pool, wick bent in on itself like a figure resting. He didn't move either thing. Some objects were better left, as they had ended, at least for a while. Outside, the orchard waited. Frost clung to the grass, each blade sharp and silver in the dim light. He pulled on his coat, scarf, and the gloves with the hole in the thumb. The cold bit his face as he stepped out, breath blooming in front of him, breaking apart into the kind of air that felt almost brittle. The trees stood in their winter bones, the work of yesterday's pruning visible in the clean angles where branches had been cut back. It wasn't pretty yet. That was the truth about pruning. At first, it made things look worse, bare, almost sad. But in the spaces left behind, light would find a way in. He knew that now. He walked the rows slowly, boots crunching over the crust of frost. Every few steps, he reached out and touched the bark, rough under the palm, cool and still holding the night's damp. Some trunks were gnarled, marked by years of storms, insects, and time. Others were younger, slimmer, with a bit of green still showing at the joints. He stopped by the tree Jonas had once called the stubborn one, a branchy old thing that never took to easy trimming. Daniel had cut deep yesterday, taking away limbs that had long shaded the rest. He could see it clearly now. The sunlight would hit the lower branches come spring, and maybe for the first time in years, it would bear well. He lingered there, glove resting against the scar of a fresh cut, and thought of the empty chair at yesterday's table. It wasn't grief exactly, not the sharp kind, but a hollow he recognized. It was the space left for someone who might never return, yet whose absence still shaped the room. He had learned in the service that you didn't always fill those spaces. Sometimes you just carried them. Like the weight of a pack you'd stop noticing until you set it down. By the far fence line, the ground dipped toward the creek. Ice had gathered along the edges, the water running dark and narrow through the middle. He crouched, picked up a stone, and rolled it in his palm before sending it skimming over the surface. It struck once, twice, then disappeared. He straightened, breathing deep, letting the smell of wet earth and cedar sit in his lungs a moment before letting it out. Back at the house, he found a thin trail of boot prints by the porch, small ones from the heel dragon size. They led up the steps to the door and stopped. No knock, no note, just the prints and then nothing. He followed them with his eyes until they dissolved into the yard's frost. Whoever it was, they'd come close enough to decide, then turn away. That he understood. There was a time not long ago when he might have done the same. He went inside, filled the kettle, set on the stove. While it warmed, he sliced what was left of the bread from yesterday, laid the pieces on a pan, and slid them under the broiler for a quick toast. The smell filled the kitchen, rich and simple, the kind of smell that made a house seem more alive than it was. Coffee in hand, he took a seat by the front window. The orchard stretched out before him, rose fading into the slow lift of fog at the far end. He sipped, the steam clouding his glasses for a second, and thought about what came next. Not in the way a soldier planned for the next mission. No rigid timetable. No command structure. Just the kind of wondering that left room for a day to make its own offer. Maybe he'd take Ruth up on her Tuesday library work. Maybe he'd help Alden with his fence come thaw. Maybe, when the first bud showed, he'd invite the same neighbors back for another meal. Only this time with the orchard in bloom and the windows open. The thought didn't make his chest tighten like it once would have. The kettle whistled, a steady sound that filled the quiet without breaking it. He poured the rest of the water into the French press, watched the grounds bloom and sink, a slow swirl like silt in a river. When it was ready, he filled a second mug and set it across from his own at the empty place. The steam curled upward, catching a blade of sunlight that had finally cut through the fog and found its way to the table. For a while, he just sat there, hands around his cup, letting the light and the warmth do their work. Outside, the frost was starting to melt, drops sliding from branch tips, catching the sun in quick, bright flashes. The orchard was already changing, almost too quietly to notice, except he was noticing now. He didn't think of it as healing. That word felt too neat, too final. It was more like the slow way a river reclaims its banks after a flood. Not in a straight line, not all at once, but with a quiet persistence that doesn't ask for applause. The trees would bear again. In time. So would he. When he finally rose from the table, he left the second mug where it was, steam still curling into the air. Not as an invitation, not as a monument. Just a small acknowledgement that some spaces are worth keeping open. Then he pulled on his coat, stepped outside, and began walking the rows again, this time not to check the work, but simply to be among the trees, in the early light, with the day ahead waiting to be found. Some stories don't end with grand gestures. They just taper into a quiet morning, where the coffee steam curls toward a sun that wasn't promised but came anyway. Daniel knew the orchard would bloom again, and so would he, in his own season. Not all at once, not without scars, but with roots holding firm beneath the soil. In the hush between one breath and the next, he understood something. Home isn't only a place. It's the willingness to keep a chair at the table, even for the absences that shaped you. And maybe that's the only kind of return that matters. If you've ever had to rebuild, whether it was a house, a life, or just a part of yourself, what was the first small thing that told you you were home again?